So as it was mentioned, today's talk is really about understanding how can we understand divine action in the Bible. And the main question I want to pose tonight is, can God be omnipotent and kenotic? Because I think that at the crux of the matter of understanding divine action in the Bible is precisely this question. So the basic where to begin with, I think, is to begin at the beginning, to understand biblical theology in general. Because biblical theology, it can be considered as a sort of theology of recital, in the sense that biblical theology begins from reciting the biblical text. So at reading the biblical text, and from the text extract any and all theological implications found therein. In other words, biblical scholars begin from the text in order to formulate a theological system. This does not mean that biblical scholarship is devoid of systematic or speculative thought, but it does mean that we have to start from the text itself. Like every framework, this method has its disadvantages, its challenges, and also its advantages. I think the great advantage of beginning from the biblical data is that you start from not from speculation and then you go and see what the biblical text says, but rather that you begin from the text itself. And the aim of systematic or speculative thought is to make explicit what is implicit in the text. The challenge is, because you're making explicit what is implicit, it's not always easy to formulate a systematic and cohesive thought on a given topic. And this is really seen, first and foremost, when we examine divine action in the Bible. Because on the one hand, it's clear God acts in the Bible, right? So from creating heaven and earth to the great acts of redemption as we see in Exodus, it's clear that God does act. However, the nature of such action is not always that clear. Because when we begin from the text, what we're actually doing, where God is known by what he has done. And what this means is that divine attributes have to be inferred. So you have to kind of work backwards. You start from what you find in the biblical text, and then you infer divine attributes from what you read. This becomes a bit problematic because sometimes God can act directly, but most often God acts indirectly, either through creation, but also through an ambassador like Moses or Elijah. And this is even more problematic when we come to Jesus, because in a way, it seems as if Jesus, God, that maximally perfect being, how could he stoop so low as to die on the cross? And so in reality, it might seem that the crucifixion seems to have been radically inconsistent with how God is supposed to act. And then the question that naturally arises is that has God committed suicide, as it were, right? Has God completely devoided himself of omnipotence, of his divinity in the death of Jesus? And I think the heart of the problem is, as I see it, is how the biblical text presents God as being, on the one hand, maximally perfect through the concept of omnipotence, and at the same time so kenotic. Indeed, from our human point of view, omnipotence and kenosis seems to be at odds with one another. In reality, they seem to be incompatible, because either God is maximally perfect and wholly other, or God is found on our level and capable of acting like a maximally perfect being. In other terms, it seems as if God is either wholly transcendent or wholly eminent. But the biblical data firmly states that this transcendent God acts eminently within and through the world in a way which might seem, from our point of view, unbecoming of God. Now, before I move on, I have to give some explanation of the term kenosis, because as we know, it's a Greek term. And in reality, this term, the noun kenosis or the verb keneo, is notorious to understand and to translate, because in reality, it's true that the basic etymology of the word group is to empty. In reality, it's as if you have like a box and you just empty it out, or like a jar of water and you pour it out. And so this is where many scholars get into problems, because it's as if Jesus or God is kenotic, well, then he is pouring out, he is emptying himself of his divinity. But I do not think that that's what the text is saying. And in reality, I think that the biblical text is making use of the larger metaphorical sense of the term. And in reality, a way to define what kenosis is that God does not selfishly exploit his divinity and his mode of being. In reality, he does not act to the advantage of himself, but rather he acts to the advantage of the other. And if this is true, if God does not selfishly exploit his divinity, well, then in this way, kenosis must define some aspect of who God is. It's about identity and not just about the minutiae of behavior. And so what are the basic claims that I want to make today? Is firstly that God is both kenotic and omnipotent. And that in reality, kenosis is not just simply divine humility, nor is it simply a divine virtue under the umbrella of moral perfection. But rather, I want to claim that kenosis is an aspect of the very identity of God. In the way, how I want to say it is that it's God concretely uses his omnipotence kenotically. And so, in reality, as I want to claim, divine action in the world is always kenotic, according to the Bible. Now, of course, these claims are quite vast and quite big, and so I need a good roadmap in order to prove these claims. And so I think the first place to begin with is to try to explain a bit better why is it so difficult to think that God can be both omnipotent and kenotic. Then this will lead me into illustrate the biblical data, and that it shows that God is both omnipotent and kenotic, particularly if I think that biblical theology is a sort of theology of recital. And of course, I cannot be exhaustive. I cannot go into every text. I want to go into three paradigmatic texts. First, I want to look at the Genesis story, creation. Then I want to look at one particular miracle in Exodus 15. And then I want to look at how St. Paul talks about the life and death of Jesus and his exaltation in Philippians 2, 1 to 11. Then hopefully, if you have time, I want to explain that while not exhaustive, this framework should help us to understand other places where we find God acting in the Bible. Okay. With that in mind, I want to turn to the overview of the problem, and I want to answer the question, why do I think so many people find it difficult to believe that divine omnipotence is not in contradiction to kenosis? As I mentioned, the big issue is that we often begin from speculation and then we move to the biblical text. And so therefore, often authors claim that for God to be God and for God to act as God, God must have the standard divine perfections. That God must be perfectly powerful, perfectly knowledgeable, perfectly rational, and perfectly free. To these four standardized perfections, some opt to add a fifth perfection, that of moral perfection, since God must always act in the best way possible. And of course, from a systematic point of view, this is a perfectly valid framework from within which one can examine divine action. In fact, a very good author, William J. Abraham, wrote 4 volumes precisely on divine perfection, precisely through these standardized perfections, divine perfections. However, when one looks at the biblical data, we find ourselves in front of a conundrum. For God seems to act in ways which contradict these standardized perfections. What I mean here is that when we unpack what we mean by these standardized perfections, what is often intended is that God, as an absolutely perfect being, he must be unsurpassably excellent. And what this means is that in God, there can be no sense of weakness. God cannot be limited by ignorance. God cannot act in any sort of irrational way, and God must be completely free and act in a way which is befitting of him, not coerced or constrained by external factors. The problem is that when we go to the Bible and we look at places where God acts in the Bible, it does not seem that God is unsurpassably excellent. In reality, God seems to be much more vulnerable than perfect. And in fact, you see this everywhere. So for instance, most of God's actions, as I mentioned in the introduction, seems to be mediated and in and through secondary actors. And many of these secondary actors don't really seem to be successful. A very good example is when Moses, on behalf of God, so God is working through Moses, he goes to Pharaoh and he tells Pharaoh to let my people go. And of course, Pharaoh does not really listen to God. He mocks God, right? He says, "Who is the Lord? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let his people go." And in reality, it seems as if God's action there doesn't really work. And in fact, it becomes more harder on the people who have to now build bricks without the straw provided. And even Moses goes and is frustrated with God himself. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, it is clear that God's words and deeds can indeed be resisted, rejected, doubted, disbelieved, and even, of course, in Genesis 3 with the original sin, even disobeyed. And when we go to the New Testament, it does not seem that things are any more better, because Jesus is certainly mocked, betrayed, rejected, and killed. And so it does not always seem the case that God's will happen on earth as it does in heaven, and that his activity seems to be much more vulnerable than perfect. I think what's happening is that we're studying divine action decontextualized from the biblical text. We begin from speculation. I begin from thinking what I suppose how God should act. And then when I go to the biblical text, I find the opposite. And in reality, the biblical text seems to be held captive by this pursuit for conditions that seem to contradict the text. And so in reality, I think from a biblical point of view, it's more important to return to the text and to see how and in what ways God acts, to begin from the text, and from the text to build a systematic thought. And such an examination, I think, would be fruitful to explain that God, all powerful that he is, has chosen to work in and through creation instead of forcing himself on creation. And what I hope to show is that this choice is not just simply to be considered as a constraining or diminishing God's divinity, emptying, as it were, but rather it is simply the kenotic way through which God uses power. Okay, so in essence, what I think what the real issue is, and the conundrum of many scholars, is that they don't recognize the importance of kenosis, and that kenosis seems to me, from a biblical point of view, a key indicator of divine action. And as I mentioned in the introduction, I want to look at three ways in which kenosis seems to be a driver of divine action. And the first way I want to see is the way of the Creator, in which he uses power for the advantage of the other. We see this in the way he creates and in the way he delegates. The second way I want to see is the way of the Redeemer Healer, in which God uses persuasion, he teaches, and he does not force himself. And thirdly, the most powerful of the ways, the way of Christ, which is understanding the power in weakness structure. Okay, so let's start right away with the first way, the way of the Creator. We know that Genesis 1:1, the first verse in scriptures, is often translated as, "In the beginning, God created heaven and earth." The phrase "in the beginning" I'm not particularly fond of, and I do not think it does justice to either the Hebrew text or the Greek text. In Hebrew, we find the word bereshit, which literally means at the head of everything. Even in the Greek, and arche means, it doesn't just simply mean a temporal phrase, but rather principally. And I think that's the way it should be understood. Principally, most importantly, God created heaven and earth. And what this shows is that this verse is not just a simple narrative element in the first chapter of Genesis, but rather it is a kerygma, a proclamation of faith which needs to be confessed and celebrated. And intrinsically, this title page, as it were, explains two things. Firstly, God created all there is, and as creator, everything is dependent on God for life because he is the source of all existence. In reality, therefore, what this first verse of scriptures explains is that the most basic and I think most important of the divine perfections for the Bible is divine omnipotence. Of course, it shouldn't come as a surprise for us because if God is the creator of all he is, he must be omnipotent. And in reality, all other divine attributes, divine perfections, are derived from this paradigmatic attribute of omnipotence. And in fact, if you look elsewhere in scriptures, many prayers that is prayed in the Bible, like that of Susanna, Esther, and Tobit, divine omniscience, among other things, is understood to be derived from divine omnipotence. Turning back to Genesis 1, after this first statement in verse 1, we find in verses 2 to 3 God hovering over the nothingness. And then, like a bolt out of the blue, he begins to speak. In speaking, in almost inviting creation to come to be. What is interesting for me is how God directs creation to being. In the Hebrew text of Genesis 1:3, the verb let there be, in Hebrew yihyeh, is what we would call in the jussive mood. Now, the jussive mood can indeed take the place of the imperative. However, in this case, many of the grammarians, like Jerome Marocca, highlight the optative nature of the jussive, in which it's softer than a simple imperative. And a jussive is always used by one who is superior towards one who is inferior, but always in a way which is less forceful and more inviting than a simple imperative. Thusly, when God creates through the jussive, he recognizes that he is superior in all ways to creation. However, God chooses to relate to creation in a particular way, through invitation and for its own advantage. And indeed, in what this highlights is that the creation itself highlights the dialogical nature of relationship, and which explains that creation is the proper place for the covenant, and this covenant is really made for the advantage of creation. Right? It's the idea is that the final aim of the covenant is neatly encapsulated in the word shalom, because in this context it would refer to the webbing together of God, humans, and all creation in justice, fulfillment, and delight. Therefore, shalom would mean here universal flourishing, which would include things like wholeness, integrity, right relations between God, humanity, and the rest of creation. In reality, therefore, the final aim of creation is communion. Now, this becomes much more significant when one compares the biblical text to other creation myths in the ancient Near East, in particularly the Emunah Elish text, which is the Babylonian creation myth. And in reality, in the Babylonian creation myth, we find that there is a cosmic battle. I'm oversimplifying because I don't have the time to delve into it, but in reality, what we find here is a cosmic battle between Marduk and the great dragon Timniat. And at the end of the battle, Marduk wins, and he cuts the dragon into two, and he makes half of it as a tent, which covers the heavens, and the other half of it to cover the earths. And also, when we find the creation of humanity, humanity is created from the blood of the rebel god Kingu, and not for any altruistic reason, not to have communion or peace, not for flourishing, but to lighten the workload of the lesser gods. And so in reality, the Emu Elish, it becomes very similar to the situation which we find in the Exodus story, right? In which Pharaoh makes Israel under him and become his slaves, right? And so this was very typical in the ancient Near East. This, of course, is very different from what we find in Genesis 1. God does not find any resistance. There is no violence in Genesis 1. Rather than violence, we find a sort of invitation through the Joseph. And what this highlights, not only divine omnipotence, but this highlights the very way in which God uses power. And this is seen also in the specific way in which humanity is created in Genesis 1. Humanity is created in the image and likeness of God. And what is more is that God delegates his dunamis and exousia, his power and authority to humanity, not to run amok, as it were, but to act in God's stead, to act as with the same bent of mind of God. And so the two versions of creation, of the cosmic battle and no resistance, and also the creation of humanity, it could not be farther from each other. And in reality, therefore, far from using power to his own benefit, the biblical God always uses power for the benefit of the other, even to the point of delegating his own power as a fitting way to reinforce the call for communion. I think ultimately what this implies is that the very act of creation is kenotic, because God, all powerful and transcendent that he is, created creation not to be exploited or dominated over with brute force, but rather for the purpose of having an abiding covenant of shalom and peace. What is more is that this illustrates something about who God is. If kenosis can be considered as this emptying, self-emptying love, this living to the advantage of the other, it is indicative of a God whose very nature is giving of himself to his creation. This is more than a divine virtue. It is rather to be considered as a permanent revelation about the very nature of God. Okay, so if it's true that kenosis reveals a permanent aspect of the nature of God, then we should see this kenosis in action in other places in the Old Testament. I can only pick on one paradigmatic episode, the miracle of changing the bitter water sweet at Marah in Exodus 15, 22 to 26, because I think it shows very well how this kenotic God works. Just a reminder on the structure of the book of Exodus itself. Exodus is, after the introduction of the first 7 verses, it's divided into 2 big parts. The first part, 1:8 to 15:21, discusses really who is the Lord, either God or Pharaoh. And we know how that story ends, with precisely the Lord, God, being understood to be sovereign Lord. The second part, 15:22 to 40:38, the question is God among us? Yes and no. And also, in what way is God among us? Is God going to be like Pharaoh, another tyrant and slave driver who keeps us under him for his own amusement and for his own self-advantage? Or will the God of the Exodus be like the God of Genesis? And of course, you already know the answer, that the God of the Exodus is the God of Genesis. And therefore, how he will act in Exodus is very typical of the God who uses power for the benefit of others. And in reality, I think this is exactly what we find in this short example. This episode, we find ourselves at Marah, and at it's a short time after the travel from the Red Sea all the way to Sinai. We're on our way to Sinai, and at the first place they stop at, Marah, after 3 days, they don't have drinking water. And they grumble to Moses, who then Moses goes in his frustration and laments to God. What's important for me here is how God replies to Moses. Is that he teaches Moses about the property of a piece of wood. Now Moses could have done with this what he wanted. He could have listened, he could have doubted, like Gideon in the book of Genesis, in the book of Judges. He could have refuted, he could have said, I'm not doing this. But in this case, Moses does listen. He takes this piece of wood and throws it in the water to restore it. And of course, one could look at people like Philo of Alexandria, who understand that the bitter water turning sweet is from the very nature of the piece of wood, which Moses did not know about, and that God taught Moses about. But in reality, this is not a problem, Ansi. This is quite significant for us, because the miracle would be in the way in which God teaches Moses, rather than imposing himself like Pharaoh did. God teaches Moses about it in order to persuade him to act. And therefore, God intervenes. He might intervene in creation in a very naturalistic way, but this is a way which is only a way that only the Creator could. And in reality, it's very clear that this text must be understood from within the context of covenant. And in fact, verse 26 is very significant. When God says, if you listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight and give heed to his commandments and keep all of his statutes, I will not bring upon you any of the diseases I brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer. And what this is important, it puts this text directly within the covenantal relations between God and Israel. And it shows that there is a contrast between what happened in Egypt, the Egyptians, and how Israel was spared. But also it understands that God defines himself precisely as healer. This self-identification as healer, we understand that God is the creator of life and the giver of health and well-being. But of course, well-being and health is much more than physically healthy. Rather, we should understand it as relationally healthy. And what I mean here is that there is a symbolic relationship between the ethical and the cosmic, where right relations in society is dependent on living life in accordance to the will of God. And when we look at how the signs of Egypt are described as diseases, we can understand that the way that Pharaoh acted and his measures are really about anti-life and anti-creation. And by turning the ethical order upside down, he also turns the cosmic order upside down. On the other hand, we find the restoration of water, which highlights this generous, positive capacity for God to restore. And in reality, it's not about just drinking water, right? It's really about understanding that this is an invitation for shalom in order to flourish. So in this emblematic pericope, what is important for me is that God does not seem to act as a primary causal agent who creates a gap in the natural fabric by acting in a way other than normal, regular activity. It's not as if God all of a sudden appeared, right, broke the way that nature works and did something on his own, right? He did not force himself. Rather, through teaching Moses and through using that piece of wood, God acts in and through the natural causal fabric of creation. He prefers to use natural processes mediately as secondary causes to accomplish his purpose in the world, which is to enact shalom. In acting in such a way, God illustrates that he doesn't use power to his own advantage, nor does he use power forcibly. And in reality, by mediating his power through Moses, by teaching him about the properties of the piece of wood, God acts in and through creation. And by acting in such a way, God shows that he has designed creation in such a way that being kenotic is the simple, normal way for God to act. And this, of course, is indicative of who God is and not just the way he behaves, because he has designed the cosmos to act, to be in this way. Okay, so the third text in which I want to discuss is now moving to the New Testament, in which I want to do an exegetical study of Philippians 2:1-11. And of course, it stands to reason that if what I said above is true, that God's omnipotence and kenotic nature are not at odds with one another, then based on his divine identity, God has decided to use his power not to exploit or to dominate, but rather to invite and to call creation to communion, to God's rest, as it were, as we read in Psalm 95 and in Matthew 11. And it seems to me that if such logic of the First Testament is present, then it must also be present in the Second Testament. If indeed Jesus is the incarnate God, then kenosis must also be the key marker in explaining Christ's own identity. And indeed, by looking to the most emblematic of cases, Philippians 2:1-11, I think this is exactly what we find. And so to be true to myself and to how I began, we need to read, bear with me, we need to read the text, and then I'll do some exegesis. So this text reads, "If then there are any encouragement in Christ, any consolation from love, any sharing in the Spirit, any compassion and sympathy, make my joy complete. Be of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interest of others. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied, this word emptied is the verb kenosis, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness. And being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God had also exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bend, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." Okay, so I could talk about this text for ages, but to cut a long story short, I think that this text is first talking about the way of Christ. What does it mean to live en Christo? What does it mean to live in Christ? And at the heart of what does it mean to live en Christo, it is to be of one mind. And the nature of being of one mind with Christ is to live this others-oriented love rather than self-interest. And why? Because to be Christ-like is to live in cruciform living. This term, which was first coined by Michael J. Gorman, it's one of my favorite terms. It's to be in conformity with the cross. And as I will state later on, the cross, therefore, is not just two pieces of wood that we put together to kill a man, nor is it simply a burden to be borne, but rather it is an embodiment of the very lifestyle that God has always lived from the very beginning. And I'm sure that you understand that Jesus did not go on the cross for his own advantage. Going on the cross meant his disadvantage and to our advantage. And so far from using power based on self-ambition and conceit, Paul tells us and tells the community to use power vulnerably, just as Christ did. And in fact, in verse 5, Paul explains very well that we have to have the same bent of mind as Jesus. And what does this mean? This is explained very well in verses 6 to 8, in which we find this downward movement, this un-Roman resume of shame and countercultural upending. Because I think for the Romans, and I think for a lot of us, is that we have this idea that Jesus acted out of character in a very ungodlike manner, right? And why is this? Because although he was God, he did not exploit this to his own advantage. He emptied himself and became human, and this is both in the incarnation, right? He wasn't feeling cold, he wasn't getting tired, and then all of a sudden in the incarnation he feels these things. But more so, he humbled himself even more so by dying on the cross. And so this is indicative of the life of Jesus as being non-self-centered and self-giving obedience. And so while this might seem to be this un-Roman resume of shame and this way of acting out of character, we know that Jesus acted precisely the way God always asks. In the Synoptic Gospels, this is particularly seen in the testing scene in the desert, in which the devil is not questioning whether or not Jesus is God. He knows Jesus is God. And in reality, what he's doing is he's trying to tempt Jesus to use power to his own advantage, right? Why shouldn't Jesus, he's hungry. Why shouldn't Jesus make bread from stone? Why? He knows his time hasn't come yet. Why shouldn't he jump from the cliff? If he is all powerful, why shouldn't he be the king of all the kingdoms of the earth? Why shouldn't he? And the answer, why shouldn't he, is because that's not the way that God asks. And in reality, by proving, by passing the tests, he shows that he is God. And so for this reason, in the therefore of verse 9, it's not a sort of promotion or reward, right? It's not as if Jesus, he was obedient and then gets the cookie of heaven, right? Gets the reward of heaven. But in reality, the exaltation of Jesus is a direct consequence of his obedience. Since he acted in the way that he was supposed to act, he takes his rightful place. Therefore, his exaltation, his vindication, is the natural consequence for the fact that he lived the life he was supposed to. And what this shows is that Jesus is equal to God. And because he's equal to God, he has shown this in being kenotic. And so, in this hymn, we see how the incarnation and death of Jesus on the cross are not to be contradicting divine action, understood through those 4 or 5 standard divine perfections. On the contrary, divine kenosis explains very well how God, all powerful that he is, does not exploit divinity for his own advantage. God is therefore seen to be essentially kenotic in Jesus, where kenosis is not only an expression of divine freedom, divine rationality, divine knowledge, but also in the way he exercises power. And so by reciting the text, by reading the text, by basing myself on the text, I found out that I can rehabilitate the God's maximally perfect nature through the hermeneutic of the cross. Why? Because, of course, if God always asks canonically, clearly he's acting rationally. Clearly he's actually free. He's acting in freedom. Clearly he's acting morally. Clearly he knows what's coming. Clearly he's omnipotent, right? And so in reality, by looking at kenosis, we can rehabilitate God's maximally perfection nation. As I mentioned before, the cross is therefore not just 2 pieces of wood to put together to kill a person or a burden to be borne, but rather it is a lifestyle, the lifestyle typical of God. And so the Christ kenosis does not hide his divinity or empty his divinity, but rather it reveals his divine majesty. It is precisely because Jesus is God that he is kenotic. Okay, so time is short and I need to move towards the conclusion. And so in order to move towards the conclusion, what I hope I have illustrated is that we must move towards a new mode of looking at the counterintuitive way God acts. In this contribution, I have attempted to illustrate that it is indeed possible to keep omnipotence and kenosis together, so as to provide a better hermeneutic to understand divine action in the Bible. In order to do so, I first explained that I think the problem is that we begin from speculation and then go to the biblical text to see whether or not what I think how God should act is also seen in the Bible. And what happens is that we see that there is this contradiction. And that the problem, therefore, seems to be speculation and not the text is the starting point. And then in reality, I have stated that we must start from the text, and from the text we can build a theological system. And in this way, I've presented 3 emblematic cases which explain the nature of divine action in the Bible. And we saw both the Genesis 1, creation, a miracle, Exodus 15, and Philippians 2, 1 to 11. And in each case, I hope what was noticed is that God always works kenotically, right? So in creation, through the use of the jussive mood and delegation of power and authority to humanity. And when we looked at the way of the Redeemer Healer, that we saw that God uses teaching, persuasion, and rather than imposing himself. And thirdly, Jesus' equality to God does not mean that he uses power as a means of exploitation and self-benefit, but rather to redeem humanity by incarnating and dying on the cross, which is to our advantage. In this way, I hope I've illustrated that the biblical God is indeed both omnipotent and kenotic, and that kenosis is an aspect of the very identity of God, and is to be understood as the way in which God concretely uses his omnipotence. Indeed, it's hoped that it is clear that kenosis is the sine qua non of divine action, because kenosis bears the stamp of divine identity. Of course, this contribution is clearly not exhaustive. I don't have the time to go through all of the many examples of divine action. However, this contribution has had the aim to provide you for a framework, a hermeneutic in which one can understand divine actions in the Bible. For instance, one can look at the 10 signs and wonders in Egypt and understand very clearly why God would act in and through nature, rather than just appearing to Pharaoh and to do everything himself. This also can be seen in other acts in the Old Testament, particularly in the miracles of Elijah and Elisha. And I think an episode in Elisha, it's very indicative. When he finds in front of him Naaman the Syrian. And Naaman the Syrian comes from abroad, and he comes to Elisha, he who is sick, he is leprosy. He comes to Elisha and expects to find something big. And Elisha only tells him, go and bathe in the Jordan River. And Naaman the Syrian will have none of it. In the text, he's very grumpy about it, and he whines about it. And then an attendant, a slave, tells him, no, you just listen, just obey. And he goes and he bathes himself in this innocuous water, right? And he gets healed. So there are many ways in which God acts kenotically in the Old Testament. I think that this is also a way in which we can understand the prophetic word. And of course, in the New Testament, through understanding through divine action, through kenosis, can help us understand clearly the other words and deeds of Jesus, and also the words and deeds of Peter and Paul in the Acts of the Apostle. In reality, I think that kenosis can in fact explain how God can be at the same time maximally perfect and yet be resisted, since God never uses power forcibly, but rather in a way which invites others to communion. Moreover, through the concept of kenosis, I was able to rehabilitate the standard divine perfections of omnipotence, omniscience, rationality, freedom, and morality, since all moral, free, rational, omniscient, and omnipotent divine actions must be understood through the self-lowering nature of God. This also means that divine actions, which in scriptures has always the aim to enact shalom, cannot be understood in isolation from creation's response. Certainly, if we are created in the image and likeness of God, then we have to act with the same bent of mind as God. Therefore, to be fully human, it means to act kenotically. And of course, since God does not force himself on us, if we do not act kenotically, but are self-involved, we can end up like rejecting God like Pharaoh did in the past. And so to conclude my lecture, I think that that kenosis, this power and weakness structure, is not only the best hermeneutical frame to understand that action is indeed divine, but it is the best way to welcome such divine action so as to open the door to flourishing and peace. Thank you.